Welcome to the Career Refresh Podcast. I'm your host, Jill Griffin. I'm a former media and marketing executive turned career strategist and executive coach. I spent my career working my way up and through the ranks of global organizations and startups, and today I show others how to do the same. Join me each week as we discuss the strategies and actionable steps to leverage your strengths, increase your confidence, and develop your career well-being. Ready? Let's do it. Hey friends, this is the Career Refresh, and I'm your host, Jill Griffin. This week, I introduce you to Ernest Lupinacci. He's the founder and CEO of Ernest Industries. And this conversation is filled with quotes, stories, and anecdotes. And I know you are going to enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed chatting with Ernest. I had the pleasure of meeting Ernest when we both worked at Anomaly, where he was a founding partner and the chief creative officer. And there was a time at Anomaly where the other partners told me that I was no longer allowed to drink anything whenever I met or sat near Ernest, because I would always end up laughing so hard that I'd be spitting the water out my nose, which is completely gross, but a reality. Ernest brings a distinguished career blending creative and strategic consultancy, brand development, and cutting-edge technology. He has a history of award-winning recognition at Wieden & Kennedy, and he's worked with eminent brands like Apple, Google, CAA, and WME. Ernest's creativity transcends advertising. He's had successful sales of feature film projects to major studios like DreamWorks and Sony Pictures. Additionally, he co-produces the Paramount Plus miniseries The Offer, shedding light on The Godfather's creation, which, by the way, listen in, because Ernest and his family were all cast in the original Godfather. And many of you have been listening for some time. I call myself the career consigliere, and The Godfather is one of my favorite movies. In addition to his remarkable professional journey, Ernest advises live stream shopping giant Talk Shop Live and consults for Viral Nation, a global leader in talent, marketing, and technology. You definitely want to grab your notes app so that you can take notes on all of the goodies that Ernest drops on us today. In this conversation, we delve into topics including the difference between passion versus talent and the art of writing and a creative life, how to maintain relevance in a dynamic world, why being of service is of maximum value, the law of inevitability. Throughout it all, we give advice for job seekers, and we also talk throughout about the significance of career narrative and storytelling. So friends, dig in. As always, if you have any questions, email me at hello@jillgriffincoaching.com, and we will definitely get those questions to Ernest, and we will answer them on a follow-up show. Enjoy this episode. Dig in. And I'll see you next time. Hey, Ernest, I am so excited that you are joining me today. Thank you for making the time. All right, so I want to jump right in. And a question I ask most of my guests is take us back and tell us, what did you think you wanted to be when you grew up?
Well, that's a very interesting and existential question. I always joke around when I currently am working with a lot of colleagues who could easily be my children. And I tell them this funny anecdote that when I was growing up, we all had the Fisher-Price wooden people,
right?
The whole menagerie. Yeah. And in retrospect, if the Fisher-Price wooden people didn't do it as a job, I just assumed it wasn't a viable career choice. And
you were going to be a farmer or...
Again, because everyone I knew was like a farmer. Like my father was a police officer. And my best friend's father was a fireman. And my first girlfriend's father was a salesman. And I didn't even know what he sold, but he was just a salesman. Like things seemed very sort of archetypal, but there also only seemed to be like a dozen jobs. And there were more, but most people just knew what they were, because the really interesting jobs used to be at the fringes of society, for lack of a better phrase. And then ultimately, now everybody's a Pilates instructor and everybody is a software coach. There seems to be more opportunities, but when I went away to university, I assumed I was going to get a liberal arts education because I was interested in becoming a lawyer.
No, okay.
But part of the reason was because the things I really wanted to do just seemed incredibly impractical. Like in retrospect, I would have loved to have pursued acting.
Okay.
But growing up, where I grew up, when I grew up, the thought of asking my parents, who had 4 other children besides me, to put me through acting school, because, the notion was, well, there's a 1,000,000 to 1 chance that you'll be able to, make a living as an actor, which means you'll probably be working in Blockbuster Video. And it wasn't that their advice was misguided. It was just not as informed, meaning the first time I stepped onto the set of a commercial that I had written, I just assumed it was going to be me, the director, the client, and, the actor dressed as the chicken spokesperson. When in reality, there was an army of people on the set
that make it work.
And I
Yeah.
was like, who are all these people? And, the short answer is they were all the different skilled tradespeople who work in the entertainment industry, who, by the way, all make great livings and are in unions and have incredible benefits. But I think we, or at least I, we grew up in a very different time.
Yeah.
Whereas it was like you could only kind of see towards the end of your nose. So you tended to do the things that seemed very familiar.
Right. Right. And it was like, to your point around, potentially being an actor, to my point about being a musician, it was often the idea of have your hobby, but get a job. So you want to play music, you want to play the piano, Jill, and do concerts, great. But you got to make money. So, whether it's a doctor or a nurse or a lawyer, like whatever you want to be, but you have to have a job to make money. And it was I completely agree with you, very different time. I mean, I have a young man in my orbit who is now going to forestry school because his goal is to be working in a national park for the United States and be able to do that. I mean, like, it's amazing and not even on my radar as something that could have been possible, regardless of all the posters that you saw sticking up in like the college admissions office about go into biology and forestry.
And in reality, as simplistic as it sounds, with living now in the age of, the wonders of the internet, you can go online and go, oh, as a matter of fact, there is a pathway to this and there's an infrastructure to this. I always joke around that I'm always trying to, pick up new skills or trying new things professionally, personally. And whenever I have like a gigantic anxiety attack, because I'm like, well, how am I ever going to figure this out? I always remind myself, and I even use this as a piece of advice to people. I go, everything is a wedding, meaning you've probably been to a wedding in the last year. And there's a pretty good chance that neither the bride nor the groom were geniuses. And yet they planned a wedding. And the reason most people aren't intimidated to plan a wedding is because there's something that I'm going to refer to as the wedding industrial complex, like the military industrial complex.
Yep.
So we all take it for granted. It's like, well, there are caterers and there are bands and there are DJs and there are photographers and there are florists. And because you've experienced that supply chain and that infrastructure, you've demystified that concept. So similarly, when I work, I work with a lot of founders, I work with a lot of startups, and, I always remind them, I'm like, there is a version of that for everything. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of friends who, because over the years, one of the things I always describe myself as a recovering Catholic. So having now shamed myself into doing a lot of the things I wanted to do, as I started writing long form content and getting involved in producing long form content, every once in a while, a friend will reach out and say, hey, G, I saw that you published this book or you were a producer of this project. I really have this desire to, say, write a screenplay. I just, I don't think I'm going to have the time to establish my own movie studio. And that's a bit of hyperbole. But again, it's that notion of like, no, 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 no. Like, you don't have to start a movie studio to write a screenplay.
Right. Right.
But again, we tend to think that way because to some degree, it's just, it's just the kind of logic of it all.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet, when you take a step back from it, even because over the years, like some of the brands I worked on that I loved working on, whether it was Nike or the Gap, I used to work for these giant apparel companies. And the reality is, Nike doesn't own factories. And when I say that to colleagues, or I'll mention that anecdotally in a meeting, someone will go, "What do you mean?" I go, I remember the first time I was in a meeting where Phil Knight had to even point out to one of his lieutenants, he goes, "We are a design and marketing company. We
Right.
literally do not manufacture things."
Right. So the takeaway for our listeners and all of that is that there's the part you're seeing, whether it's your interaction with a doctor, your interaction with a Broadway show, your interaction with a movie. But in order to bring that together, there are so many roles along the way. So that the idea is, well, what do you want to be? What are you good at? How do you work with someone or a mentor or a coach to figure out what you're good at? And there's probably a job for it that you can plug into. I love that.
This time of year, my son is beginning college this fall. I have a lot of friends whose children are either, starting college, graduating, and I love to have the conversation, what do you want to do for a living? And what's funny is most of the young adults I talk to, they're actually surprisingly practical. They're like, "Well, I'm very interested." And I go, "No, no, 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 no. I'm talking dream jobs." And the reason, I sort of go down this route is and to sort of rephrase what you just said, we are living in a moment in time where you could pretty much make a living doing almost anything.
Yeah. Which is inspiring or scary, depending on your mindset.
Absolutely. But again, that ability to really think, what are my talents, not necessarily my passions, because, as a writer, at the end of the day, if somebody asks me what I do, I like to be able to say I write. I take a lot of pride in saying, I make a living writing. So words are really important to me. And the words, when I work with a client, if I'm writing a screenplay, like it's kind of fun to choose very precise words. But, I have a lot of passions, but they aren't necessarily talents.
Mm.
And, you can't choose your talent.
Yeah, no, it chooses you. It chooses you. And then it's whether you practice it with time and knowledge and additional skills. Yeah.
So that's a real, for me, that's a real benefit of self-awareness when you're like, these are the things I'm really good at. And these are the things that bring me fulfillment versus happiness. Like, again, like happiness is a reaction. And there's a lot of things I do that, one of my favorite quotes about writing is Martin Scorsese once said, "Writers don't finish, they just give up." Like you just get to the point where you go, I can't revise it anymore.
Right.
But, when I talk to people about what they're doing or what they want to do or what they like to do, and I'm always surprised, I feel very lucky because if somebody says, "Well, would you know what you like to do?" And I go, "Yeah, I could spend all day reading and writing." One thing I always encourage people to do is like really think. It's like if you could spend your day doing anything, getting paid to do anything, what is it? Where do you really find fulfillment? And it's a great place to start.
Yeah.
And then something, I had this epiphany years ago that people in general, but the kind of clients that we worked with in our lives as marketers, people in general, but companies and businesses specifically, they tend to think quantitatively when they should think qualitatively and vice versa. So I had done some branding. I did a big B2B campaign for this cybersecurity company. And they loved the presentation. And I thought, we were all set. And before the elevator I was taking down to the lobby of the building they were in got to the ground floor, they texted me and said, "You have to come back up here. We have an emergency." And I couldn't imagine what had happened. And we had a good enough relationship that I could kind of rib them. So when I returned to the conference room, They were huddled around the whiteboard. And I have a theory that whoever is specifically writing on the whiteboard is the one person who has the worst handwriting, because they're not really writing.
Or they went with me to Catholic school. And
yeah, well, they're just sort of like they're just like punctuating as they're writing. And I walked in and I said, well, what's going on here? And they said, we love your idea, but we don't think it's going to apply to all of the different clients we have. And I said, well, don't all of your clients need cybersecurity? And they said, no, but look at the whiteboard. Look at all the different types of clients we have. We have big clients and small clients and pre-IPO and post-IPO and national and regional and not. And they had, in some ways, they had credibly come up with, 24 types of clients. But I said, no. At the end of the day, I'm a salesman. And if I needed to sell you, Jill, cybersecurity, I would say, Jill, you run exactly the kind of company we do our best work for. Mm. You run an extraordinary company. Because extraordinary is a quality, and it is a quality that no one would deny having. And also, like as a job seeker, you can do yourself a disservice when you think about what you do quantitatively, or you think about what you describe what you want to do quantitatively. Right. Like I always say to people, it's like, I'll work on anything as long as it's interesting.
Right. So let's take a step back and let's talk about, okay, so you grew up, I think, in the New York area, correct? Right?
Yeah.
You went to university, and did you go right into working within copywriting? And
no, in fact, just the opposite. Okay. When I was in high school, I did a lot of extracurricular activities that satisfied the creative part of my identity.
Okay.
But again, I was very practical. I was going to get a liberal arts degree and apply to law school. When I went to university, I started rowing, which takes up a tremendous amount of time. And there just wasn't a lot of time to do a lot of things other than row and study. And I was feeling really sort of unmotivated. And in the second semester of freshman year, I pledged a fraternity. And I just was drawn to when, if we would have a party or something, I was always designing t-shirts or doing, I was doing basically promotion. And I'll never forget one of the fraternity brothers who had already, he was an upperclassman. We were chatting one day and he goes, so are you studying marketing? And I went, no. I was like, why would you say that? And he goes, well, I just assumed you were studying marketing because you have a preternatural ability for it.
He's so good at it, right?
And that's when the kind of light went off where I was like, oh, it's that's something creative, but it's not acting, which seems like a huge risk. It's not being an artist. There was this sense of it was a profession with a career track.
Right. And an easier way to monetize it, or a more obvious way to monetize it.
Well, and also for me, it was like the idea of being an accountant or a stockbroker. It's I can barely, do addition. So that was, again, one of those weird happy accidents. And when I returned to university for my sophomore year, I dropped all the classes I had registered for, changed my major, and all of a sudden, my GPA went up, and but again, it was the beginning of this sense of
truly playing to your strengths, which we talk about a lot. It's when you're playing to your strengths, the least amount of effort all of a sudden results in 10x results versus, we can make improvement against things that we're kind of mediocre at, but we're not going to make the same impact when you're versus going into what you're good at. I love that.
I do think, in a strange way, because I basically became a fine arts student, a fine arts major. Mm-hmm. And, classes were 3 hours long. And, and this was a point in time where all my friends were trying to never take a class before noon. How little time could I spend in class a week? And there were days where I would have 3 studio art classes. I was in class 9 hours a day. But in retrospect, it had that sort of
it's like revving your engine. You were getting excited about it.
And also there's a fantastic documentary called The Deadline Artists. And it's basically the story of when Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill were both writing daily articles for the New York Post and the Daily News. But neither one of them, they didn't go to journalism school. When they were 14 years old, they became copy boys.
Amazing.
So that notion of like, again, like vocation.
Yeah. Proximity.
Just, grinding it out. And one of the things, I mean, I haven't worked on a commercial production in a while, but the thing I always loved about being on a set was these were literally, they were crafts people.
Mm-hmm.
And, they learned their craft by doing it over and over and over and over, which is why, you better enjoy what you're doing, because there's a chance you're going to do it over and over and over.
Right. Right. So I'd love for you to tell, you and I worked together at Anomaly years ago, which is where I first had the pleasure of meeting you, you being the chief creative officer and founding partner. I was a communications digital lead on various businesses, and you just had such this fresh way of thinking. And I always wondered like how you got there. So I know that you spent time at Wieden, but take our listeners through at a high level a bit of your trajectory so that people understand, a lot of times people think that it's a linear path, and it's not always linear.
I mean, and the funny thing is you can sort of berate yourself after the fact of thinking, I should have done this, I should have done. And for the first few years of my career, I remember, you, like to your point about, you meet people and you start networking and you get together, especially when you're younger, and you're always commiserating. And I was always complaining. I thought, I should have gone to Syracuse and gone to the Newhouse
School. Right.
And my friends who had gone on those paths, they would go, sure, but you just got hired to go work at Wieden Kennedy Amsterdam, and we didn't. So part of it is there's certainly simpler ways to do it, right? But at the same time, one of my mentors and best friends is Tom Carroll, who was the CEO of TBWA Chiat.
Sure.
And he worked, side by side with Lee Clow forever. And he always said, Lee always said that the real definition of creativity is receptivity. That ability to be open to new ideas is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started looking for jobs in advertising, I was very lucky. I worked at this small boutique called Weiss Witten, Carol Stagliano. Tom was the Carol and Carol Stagliano. Okay. Although people would send mail to the agency and they thought there was a woman who worked at the agency named Carol Stagliano. Which,
that's of course, funny. Although it kind of sounds like a law firm.
Well, again, like those were the days where, like, traditionally the age, the agencies were just the names of the part, Doyle Dane Burnback.
Right.
And it was a great place. And what was, I think, crucial for me is Stagliano was Adam Stagliano, and he was the first planner in America who was a partner who had his name on the door. So there were agencies where planners were partners, but their names weren't on the door. So, from a very young age in the industry, planning and strategy was really, a big part of the quote unquote the creative process. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there was a whole group of, contemporaries, writers and art directors my age who I'm still friends with a lot of them. They were really smart. And then the four partners, Marty Weiss, Nat Witten, Tom Carroll, and Adam Stagliano, they had all worked at really great agencies. Specifically, most of them had come from Chiat. So, a lot of that information was like sort of passed down to us. Mm-hmm. And, it was just that sense of, how could you apply this? In what ways could you apply it? And it was, and the truth is, I loved working in advertising. To me, it was such a fun, fantastic,
absolutely agree with
career.
You. Yeah.
So always looking, and then sort of thinking it became my fantasy to go work at Wieden and Kennedy. So, in that sense of, one of my heroes is Robert Evans. So he was the producer who ran Paramount.
Yep.
And,
isn't he the kid that stays in the picture?
The kid stays in the picture. And one of his, apocryphal quotes that's, attributed to other people, but I always associate it with him is he would say the definition of luck is when preparation and opportunity meet. Mm-hmm. And I always think about that because, at the moment in my life where I got as lucky as I could be, when I was hired at Widener, I remember friends going, wow, you're so incredibly lucky, because I was hired to go work in Amsterdam. And I think there were only like 16 employees in the entire office, including, the receptionist. But I had worked on my portfolio like obsessively. I had sent them a spec book because even at that point in my career, like I didn't feel like I had produced enough work that would get me the job I wanted. So, I think that's why I always encourage people, like, whatever that thing you're doing is, where you go, oh my God, I should be, I should be doing my taxes, or I should be finishing this PowerPoint, or I should be finishing this, but instead I'm doing this. You have to figure out how to commercialize it and monetize it.
Right. Because it's going to make the days.
It's the thing you want to be doing.
Right. So you've had this amazing, again, experience between working at almost every major advertising network. You've worked for brands like Apple, Nike, Google, etc. Again, through your agency relationship. And one of the things, I admire many things about you, Ernest, but one of the things I've always admired is just this going from an employee to a consultant, and the impressive tenure in which you have continued to stay in it, relevant, producing great work. We'll talk a bit about, some of your film projects too during this conversation, but what would you attribute your ability to stay in that level of freelance, well, not freelance, but consultancy through this level of time? That is no small feat.
I think, again, some of this, it sounds like psychology, some of it sounds like strategy, and some of it is just, the things you say to yourself while you're having, an anxiety attack. But a lot of it is, a few years ago, Howard Stern interviewed Jimmy Iovine. Mm-hmm. And it was it's one of those incredible interviews where I remember after listening to it thinking, well, you can go to Harvard Business School, or you could listen to this Jimmy Iovine interview a couple of times. And he just told, he would, at any given moment, he would be telling Howard some great anecdote about a suggestion he made to an artist, or a decision he made about how to produce an album. And Howard would go, well, how did you think of doing that? And he would just say, almost like his motif was, be of service. He just kept saying, like, be of service, be of service, be of service. So for me, we literally, if you're a consultant, you work in the service industry.
Yes.
And I always joke around that from years and years and years of pitching ideas, presenting concepts of all different types to all different types of people, through the process of trial and error, I determined that there is a 3-word phrase that we should all use when we put an idea on the table, no matter what the idea is, no matter who's listening to the pitch. And the 3-word phrase is, how. Because it requires empathy. Mm-hmm. It's an empathetic gesture. It's also the sort of thing where it's a great firewall, because you need to be very confident that the person's going to go, yes.
Right.
So often when I would reach out to, colleagues, or if I can't tell you how many times I would send someone, an email. Like if I heard someone had gotten a promotion or won a piece of business or took a really great job, I would send them an email and I go, gee, just congratulations. This is, I'm so happy for you, excited for you. This sounds fantastic. And more often than not, they would write back and say, well, gee, I'm really grateful, but can you do me a favor and come over here and help me, because I don't know what the hell I'm doing.
Right.
So it wasn't so much that I was looking for
but you were being of service
project, but also it was the sense of, I realized that, we all assume that everybody has it figured out besides us.
Right.
And more often than not, everyone's kind of scratching their head. Felt like it was my responsibility, if I was going to reach out to somebody, to really to do my homework and not just say, gee, I'd really love to come work on this. It sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun. And it's like, maybe.
Because then you've made it about you versus them.
Again, it's like, I would say to people, what's in it for them?
Yes.
You know,
You mentioned Be of Service. Did you read Unreasonable Hospitality, the
You
Will
know what?
Guerrero book?
I haven't, but I'll say
Ernest,
this. I've
I
heard,
cried tears of joy reading it because it's completely aligned with my own personal values. You will love it. I mean,
well,
I see you, I get you. It's my pleasure to service you. Like it's effectively what my personal mantra is, and that's you will love. And for everyone listening, I'll put that in the show notes so
no,
you can
that's a
read the
great
book. It's an
reminder.
excellent, excellent book.
And one of the reasons a few people had recommended it to me, but the reason it stuck in my head is that
You watch The Bear,
that and
and it was in it. Yeah.
there's a phrase I coined that I refer to as the desirable duality.
Okay.
And the notion is really great things, but really great stories possess a desirable duality. So, for instance, James Bond is licensed to kill. It makes absolutely no sense. In retrospect, he's been authorized by one of the world's most famous authorities to commit the worst crime imaginable to uphold justice. But as a writer, you can do a lot with that. So he's not a vigilante extracting vengeance with a crowbar. That's always fun.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He's also not a barrister righting wrongs with a law book, which is always entertaining. He's a British gentleman in a bespoke tuxedo strangling a double agent with his bare hands in the loo of a five-star hotel in Monte Carlo. And there's this sense of like, I didn't even know that you could get that.
Right.
And
right.
then, when you apply that to, say, a brand, like I really like my version of going to the Harvard Business School was working at Wieden & Kennedy on Nike. The people I worked with, the people I worked for, the brand at that moment. I mean, I learned so much at a really important, impressionable age. But in retrospect, I always thought, well, gee, the appeal of Nike is it created glory for the masses. Now, the line is to the victor goes to the spoils. Mm-hmm. To the one and only goes the prize. But Nike created this sensibility of that, no, like there's a potential for all of us to experience that glory, which doesn't seem possible. And yet, phrases like unreasonable hospitality, like it's a great phrase because it creates that sort of tension where you go, well, what could or would that be?
What would be unreasonable? Right.
Like I always joked around, if I ever had the ability to brand Warren Buffett, I would say he's a glutton for value. Because you shouldn't be a glutton for value.
Exactly.
But he is, and I can understand it and I can explain it. And those, the ability, one of my favorite constructive criticisms I ever, picked up as a writer is the best way to approach any writing assignment, but kind of anything, is to simplify then exaggerate.
Oh, okay. That's a good takeaway for everyone.
But, when you think about, a point you're trying to make, a brand you're trying to create, or even, like I'm going to go to Paris for a weekend. I'm not going to try to get out to Versailles. I'm going to simplify
and go deep.
Then I'm going to exaggerate.
Right.
And again, those sorts of things, it's like, at any given moment, these are things that like, when I'm struggling, when I'm looking for ideas, I kind of go to the well and I go, calm down, take a deep breath, simplify, and exaggerate.
Yeah. I think everyone, that's definitely one you want to grab your notes app and make note of that to remember as a way to get through whatever it is that you're working on. Which brings me to the next question I have for you, which is around the job search. I know that you have a few concepts that you and I have talked about before around both the attention economy and also the law of inevitability. When we think about what's going on in the marketplace right now, right? So we're in this ridiculously unique time where wages are still very high. I'm talking US folks. Unemployment is still at all-time lows. There's something like 2 jobs posted for every person who would actually be available out there. Yet we have the actors strike, we have the writers strike, we have all of this interesting time of like paradoxical, how are we working through this? I've said to many people that this 4th of July, I had 3 clients receive offers on July 3rd, which was a Monday this year, which is normally the sleepiest week ever in advertising outside the week between Christmas and New Year, right? So When you think about this and you're thinking about how you can attract attention, whether you want a new job or whether you're coming from unemployment, I love this idea of attracting attention, the attention economy. And how would you apply that, or the advice that you would apply to job seekers today?
So there's a couple things, and the way you phrased that and delivered it is so apropos, because it's almost like the conversations I'll have with someone where they'll call me up and they'll, in an exasperated tone. So again, a lot of this is just like having lived this. So I have this fantastic entertainment lawyer named Jeff Finkelstein. He's amazing. And we have this incredible relationship because I do not come from a traditional Hollywood background. So often I'll present ideas to him, I'll share concepts with him, and he'll listen to everything and he'll entertain everything. But we have this longstanding joke, because at the point at which it's time to sort of like do the pitch, he'll say, well, what do you think the chances are they're going to buy it? And I always say the same thing, 50-50. They'll buy it or they won't. And he always goes, well, it doesn't really work that way. And I go, no.
But it kind of does.
It does.
There's only two answers.
Why was it going to go? They can't not buy it 1,000,000 to 1 times. Right. So the first thing I always encourage anybody, like I'm not a big gambler, but if I'm in Las Vegas, it's fun to play blackjack.
Sure.
Blackjack is not a team sport. I don't mean to be social Darwinist, but you only have to beat the dealer.
Right.
So at any given moment, when people go, everybody's looking for a job, and it's like, but you don't have to get everybody a job.
You just have to get yourself a job.
Exactly. As soon as you let your brain drift and start thinking everybody is looking and it's like, sure, but you just have to get yourself a job. Then to your point, at any given moment, if you go onto LinkedIn, I mean, companies are in fact hiring.
Yeah, they are.
And a friend of mine who does HR had this great insight years ago. She said, look, you can write a job opening and you could say what you're looking for. But if you're looking for somebody who, has 5 years experience working for NASA and has 12 degrees and started, like, you could write that.
Yeah, you just have to find that unicorn.
It doesn't mean that person exists.
Right.
So I always think, again, in the spirit of simplify and exaggerate, it's like, stop worrying about how many people are looking for jobs and how bad it is. Because years ago, I was selling the first piece of property I had ever bought. And at the time, all the headlines in the real estate said, record buyers. And I thought, oh my God, why am I selling if everybody's buying? And then I thought, well, wait a minute. If everyone's buying, then everybody is selling.
It's basic supply and demand.
and it's funny because, again, going back to semantics, if you look at the history of how, like, to your point, there's an actor strike. Well, labor always makes demands and management always makes concessions. But that's not the reality. Everyone makes demands, and
everybody makes concessions.
So there's a vernacular. So the first thing you have to remind yourself is, am I applying for a job that I'm actually qualified for? And then am I going about it in the sanest, most logical way? And I will say that, the ability to have a network, build a network is extraordinary. There's really nothing like it because, and I always joke around, there's this, I'm going to butcher it, but I think it was called Haldane's Law. And it's this overview of, like, it applies to science specifically. And the idea is we know what we know and we know what we don't know.
Okay.
But we don't know what we don't know. So I always remind people, I'm like, at any given moment, someone will go, well, I really want this job. And I go, hold on a minute. To your point about 3 colleagues being given offers on July 3rd. I'll always, like, hold somebody on the shoulders and look them in the eye and go, you don't know that there's someone at the company you want to work for right now who doesn't even know.
Yeah.
Do you know Jim Riswold? Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah.
So Jim, again, is one of those people that I owe, my career and my livelihood to. Before I even started working for Jim Riswold at Wieden & Kennedy, I was learning how to write ads because Jim Riswold did all the great Nike ads. And years ago, he called me up. We were chatting one day and he goes, I just heard that Joe Blow got this job. And I always wonder why people don't call me for those kinds of jobs. And I said, Jim, everyone just assumes you own Wyden and K. Like no one would ever think to offer you a job because they would be embarrassed because they would just assume that you're not looking for a job.
Right. Right.
And he goes, well, I am looking for a job. And I go, but I don't know that. And I'm not hiring. So part of it too is it's like, and again, like, are you saying the right thing to the right person at the right time at the right way?
Mm-hmm.
Like LinkedIn, they have this sort of, you kind of put a filter on your profile that says open to work, but it's like, it's just like, it's like almost like the filter should say recently laid off, desperate for a job. Mm-hmm. So even the sense of like,
which people were not going to do that from the executive coach standpoint. I'm going to tell you, don't put that on your resume. I mean, on your LinkedIn profile. We don't like that.
or like I've even said to people, I was very fortunate because after 6 years at Wieden & Kennedy, having been able to work in the Amsterdam office, then the Portland office, then the New York office. So being able to work for the same company for 6 years. And the great thing about Wieden & Kennedy is it is one ad agency. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what office you work in. Yeah. It's one ad agency.
Yeah.
So I worked with the same people for 6 years in 3 different offices.
Yeah.
But after 6 years, I was ready for a change, and I was getting job offers. But I thought, gee, after the incredible experience I had at Wieden & Kennedy, I don't know that I could make this sort of emotional and mental commitment to another company without getting to kind of know them. So I thought, I'm gonna freelance for the summer and sort of speed date, and that actually turned into like a 6-year adventure. And that suited me because I was very lucky because one of the first things I did was the William Shatner Priceline campaign, which sort of established this notion of like, oh, well, you hire this guy, but he'll do the whole thing. Like he'll conceive it and pitch it and sell it and produce it and get it on the air. But I always say to people now too, I go, look, you say you'll go work anywhere because you really want a job, but you won't go work it. Like once you get the job, you still have to go to it. So also think about like a lot of companies are open to you consulting.
Fractional. I mean, fractional wasn't even a thing like 2 years ago. And now we're hearing about, fractional chief creative officer, fractional COO. Opportunities are in different places. You have to figure out the spin it. And what I love about the way you approach things, Ernest, is that it is this idea where you said like every business is a show business, but so are you you are the product you are marketing. So you have to think about it again. Working with someone, sometimes it's really hard to read the label from inside the jar and market your own stuff. So working with a friend, finding someone who can help you, again, a mentor, a coach, whatever works for you, but being able to tell that story. Because at the end of the day, when someone says to you, tell me about yourself, I assure you they may be a very nice human being. They don't care. They don't care. Yeah. What they care is, how are you going to make my life easier? How are you going to make sure that I get my year-end bonus? And tell me about you to make sure, because in my head, I'm checking off the boxes. So we have to tell the story based on who is the recipient. And then people say, well, I don't know who I'm going to be meeting with. Great. Then have a couple of stories in your pockets so you can pull it out of your file cabinet when you actually need to do it.
Well, it's funny, you mentioned this anecdote that I use all the time, which is every business is like show business. And that was the result of, so I'm a big believer in the marketing notion that people don't buy what you make, they buy what you believe. So when I would work with a client, we'd sit down and I would say, well, listen, I understand you do X, Y, and Z, and it requires these widgets and, Ruby on Rails, but I want to know what you believe. So it would become this sort of like, Socratic method, and we'd really kind of go at it. And I would just never give in. I'm like, listen, here's the reality. The reason people buy fire extinguishers is because they extinguish fires. Fire extinguishers extinguish fires. Do you know how they work? Who cares?
Right.
By the way, here's how they work. They spray foam on the fire. But I beg of you, do not call it a foam sprayer. fire extinguisher. So that's the easiest way that I would kind of prove that point. But a couple of years ago, I had a client look at me and goes, all right, well, what does your brand believe? And I thought, oh, this is awkward. And in the spirit of eating your own dog food, I'm like, well, let me really think about this. And I remember, there's the cliche, there's no business like show business. And I thought, no, on the contrary, every business is like show business. But I don't mean like starfuckery and glitz and glamour. It's more the notion of you at the time, and you'll be able to relate to this. About 15 years ago, I remember, I think I was consulting at Google, and all of a sudden, everyone was talking about narrative, brand narrative. We need brand narrative. It was a copywriter. I thought, wait a minute, like I've been writing ads since I was 11. Like, why are people suddenly transfixed on the notion of narrative? Now, some of it was just, it was like a highfalutin way of saying we need better ads. But in reality, real narrative is more sophisticated and complicated and powerful than just writing ads. So I thought, well, wait a minute. If all of my clients want to apply the rules of narrative to their businesses, what one category of business has done the best job of monetizing narrative historically? And the answer is show business.
Sure.
So if you take all the best practices of quote unquote show business and you apply them to bringing narrative to a brand, then yes, as a matter of fact, all businesses are like show business, because the only way you can explain something to someone or change somebody's mind or convince somebody of something or motivate them, or at least the most effective way to do it, is with a better story. So, I'll write the owner's manual for your Dualit toaster, but I will endeavor to write a better version of it.
Better story. Yeah.
So that became my sort of lens through which I saw the world.
Yeah.
And I do think that there was a period of time when I freelanced everywhere. And one of my clients joked around. He used to call me Winston Wolfe. He said, you were the Winston Wolfe of advertising. Now, Winston Wolfe is the Harvey Keitel character in Pulp Fiction, because my version of a good time was getting a frantic call from one of my clients, and they're like, we're going to lose, the Spacely Sprockets account. And I would show up the next morning at 6 o'clock in a double-breasted tuxedo with my LL Bean camouflage tote bag. And I would literally go, you gentlemen have a body in a trunk minus a head in a garage. Take me to it. But likewise, like, that's how I positioned myself. Like, my job, it's like, and one of my friends who, was one of the recruiters, the creative manager and recruiter for a big agency, she said, sometimes the chief creative officer comes in and says, we're going to need a couple of creative teams on a pitch. And she said, other times he runs it and goes, find Ernest.
He'll do it all.
But again, that idea of like, what is your brand in the marketplace?
Yeah.
What do you bring to the table?
Yeah.
That other people can't.
Right. And I think you've had the luxury, well, maybe not luxury, but you've had the necessity to think about this throughout your career, again, because you have stayed a regularly employed consultant. I think what happens very often is when we're in companies or we're in career trajectories where even if we move to the competing company, we're doing similar work, where it's like inside baseball. Everybody knows what we do, so we just keep doing that and we get hired to do that. But at a certain point, if you want to pivot, you want to step out, or if unfortunately you're made redundant, you have to know how to tell your story, whether you work in legal or healthcare or, accounting. I don't care. You have to know how to tell that story so that everyone can hear it. We talked a bit, obviously, about narrative and story. And as we sit here with the Godfather book over my shoulder, I think I, like you, am a huge fan. I always laugh. My husband watches Harry Potter all the time. I watch The Godfather because it's also a Christmas movie. There's a Christmas tree in there.
Well, listen, that and Die Hard are both officially Christmas movies.
1,000%. So tell everyone, because I only found this about you recently, which I cannot believe didn't come out in the time that we worked together, that you were actually in the Godfather movie.
Well, my whole family, we were extras in the Godfather Part 2.
Which is arguably the best. Well, maybe not. I don't know.
Well, it's funny. I'll send you I just was invited to be on a podcast to settle the debate. Which one is better, one or two?
Okay.
Spoiler alert, it's one. But I digress. My father was a New York City police detective, and his partner on the police force, he started consulting. And when he left, when he retired, he started consulting on all the cop shows that were filming in New York, like Kojak.
Amazing.
And he was a good looking guy, and they started casting him, and he started getting his SAG residuals. And he thought, wait a minute, this is great. And then he was hired to do casting for The Godfather Part 2. And he called my father and he said, listen, if you all come in, I mean, we're going to cast you because we need hundreds of extras. But what's interesting is if you shoot a movie and it's contemporary, sometimes they could literally just use people on the street. But this was a period piece. So we had costumes and we had to get our hair cut. I mean, I was only in first grade when the filming was done, but it's still like, it was very vivid.
What scene were you in? Because when I watched it this weekend, I'm going to go find it.
If you watch 2, it is literally part 2 because the material is really, it's all in the one book. But so 2 is both a prequel and a sequel.
Mm-hmm.
So we were in the scene when the young Don Vito Corleone, who's not the Don yet. It's the scene where the feast is going on.
Okay.
And he kills Don Fanucci. Okay. The Don in the white suit.
Yep.
But we were, the Italian immigrants who were on the street while they were
for the San Gennaro feast. Absolutely. Amazing.
And so it's funny because again, like that movie has played this huge part of my life. And then years later, I cast Robert Evans. I mean, talk about networking. I cast Robert Evans as voiceover talent in an ESPN Sunday night football campaign. And I always joke around that there's, in the spirit of unreasonable hospitality, one of my trademarked desirable dualities is I always tell people to try and be responsibly selfish. So whenever I would get a brief, I would go, who do I want to meet? Where do I want to go? What do I want to learn? And how can I do it in a way that I'm being responsibly selfish? So I wanted to meet Robert Evans, so I just cast him as the voiceover for ESPN Sunday Night Football.
Amazing.
And meeting him was like my Make-A-Wish Foundation day. And that, I could draw a straight line from meeting him and my fascination with him to then writing the graphic novel, The Godfather Gang, which tells the backstory about the Godfather, and then finding myself as a co-producer of the miniseries The Offer on Paramount Plus. And again, what's interesting is it is this one piece of pop culture amongst others that I've been fascinated with my whole life. And, it's like I've kind of turned it into a cottage industry. The greatest thing you could say in a job interview is I love to solve problems.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people love to create problems.
Right. But being able to solve
whether they realize it or not, but that I'm like a child of the space race. Like we were still putting men on the moon, and I was always fascinated and obsessed with, the Apollo missions. And there's this really fantastic anecdote that when in the early days of NASA, Kennedy makes this outrageous promise. He says, we will put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. And when he said it, everyone working at NASA and the Jet Propulsion Lab, everyone said, what is he talking about?
Right. Now we got to go figure it out.
How to do any of this.
Right.
So in the early days of, the quote unquote space race, he pays a visit to Cape Canaveral, and they line up, 100 employees of NASA, and they represent, I think at the time, like 450,000 people worked at NASA, but they're meant to represent every possible thing you could do at NASA, from, the lunch ladies to Werner von Braun, who runs the whole shebang. And Kennedy walks into this giant, hangar where they're building the Saturn V5 booster rockets. And he introduces himself to every single employee as if they don't know who he is. He goes down the line and goes, I'm Jack Kennedy. I'm president of the United States. What do you do here, sir? And the guy goes, well, I train the monkeys for the test rockets. And well, he gets to the janitor. Now the janitor is wearing the khaki jumpsuit with the oval patch that says janitor, and he's holding a mop.
Straight out of Central Casting.
And when Kennedy puts out his hand, he goes, I'm Jack Kennedy, I'm the President of the United States. What are you doing here, sir? And the guy grabs his hand, he shakes his arm off, and he goes, I'm putting a man on the moon, Mr. President.
Nice.
And I love to tell that story because it's like, that's what you're doing here. Regardless of your contribution, that's what you're doing here. And, again, to your point about if you want to get the job, you want the person who's sitting there, you want to put yourself in their position. You go, you know what, this person is stressed out and they're overworked. And they want to know that you're the kind of person who goes,
you're the solution to their problem.
Yeah, I'm going to solve more problems than I create. Look, in the movie version of our life, we do something and there's, the feedback loop is right there. But the idea of, putting in the time, putting in the effort, and just sooner or later going, you know what, there's a value to this directly or indirectly.
Right. And to that point, a value and evaluate, right? Being able to check in and like what worked, what didn't work. All right, what would I do differently? How do I do it? And that's how you kind of move it forward.
There's a great quote by Kurt Vonnegut. Someone once said to him, gee, you're such an incredibly prolific author, but you're also such an incredibly eclectic author. I just can't imagine how you come up with these wild ideas. And he looked at the journalist conspiratorially and he said, you want to hear a great idea for a story? And the guy was like, yeah. And he goes, guy gets into a jam, guy gets out of a jam. And the reality is, it's right. Like, that's it. There's nothing else to talk about. So those sorts of, because look, we've seen those, we've gotten the briefs and we've gotten and at some point you just kind of calm down. And again, it's like simplify and then exaggerate, it's like whatever it is, it probably is going to resonate with the audience if you put it in the context of guy gets into a jam, guy gets out of a jam.
Okay. Last question.
Please.
What are you reading or what's podcast? What do you recommend for people
a couple
to listen
things.
To?
One is, as an elder statesman now, by the end of the day, my eyes are so tired from reading and writing that I love listening to books or like I really do. And I also think that different people learn different ways. So I know that if I hear things, I'll retain the information better than even if I read them.
Okay.
So a couple of years ago, I discovered Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal podcast. And I just assumed it was like kind of Gilbert doing his shtick, and it's not. It was Gilbert, who tragically passed away last summer, and his producer and co-host, Frank Santapadre. And the two of them are two of the greatest fans and repository of great entertainment knowledge. So they would pick these fantastic topics. They would attract these incredible guests, and they would just deconstruct the most wonderful, fantastic stories. And, to your point, they interviewed the great film director, Richard Donner. Now, I didn't know that he shot the pilot for Twilight Zone. So again, it was like all these incredible stories where you go, well, yes, Mel Brooks was a genius, but Mel Brooks wrote for Sid Caesar on the Show of a Show for 10 years when it was the #1 show. So Gilbert's podcast, which is still, it's still on demand. It's a fantastic podcast. I love that. But one thing I really love to do now is, I'll listen to books on tape. It's so funny. I call them books on tape.
On tape, right.
And one of the things I enjoy doing, and part of it is it's like, I literally think of it as, professional research, is I'm always fascinated by, what is required to adapt a book into, say, for instance, a screenplay. So if I don't know, did you see The Queen's Gambit?
Of course, yeah.
So when that came out, the Friday it premiered, I follow Stephen King on Twitter, and he wrote, I just saw this show on Netflix called The Queen's Gambit. It is as good as anything I have ever seen anywhere. And I thought, well, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, let me start watching it. So I watched 6 episodes Friday night. I woke up Saturday morning and just watched the rest. And when you're binging like that, as one show ends, you just skip to the next one.
Sure.
So when the very, very last episode ended, I finally got to see the credits. And I noticed that the co-writer of the show, was also the director of the show. And I thought, if this individual conceived of this from scratch, I'm going to kill myself because this is just too much talent for one person to have. So I went online and I found out that The Queen's Gambit was published in 1983.
Wow.
Which means the author probably started writing it in the late 70s. And I thought, why did it take almost 40 years? Now, the simple answer is because historically great books had to be made into great films because there was no prestigious television.
Oh, interesting.
And now there is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, at any given moment, I love to go back and listen. Like, it's so funny that you have the Godfather book there because a lot of my friends have gone back and read it. And what's interesting is, it's like the Johnny Fontaine. You could make a movie about Johnny Fontaine.
Sure.
Right. So I'm trying to think again. The Gilbert podcast is one of my favorite things.
Okay.
I'm still a sucker for Howard Stern.
Sure.
And then likewise, there was a fantastic article in the recent issue of the New Yorker about Elon Musk's lawyer, Alex Spiro, who also happens to be a very good friend of mine. But what I love is even those sorts of articles now, they tend to record, you could read or you can listen.
Read them. Sure.
But, it's funny because like what I'm listening to or reading is as a,
it's one, you don't necessarily distinguish what form it's in.
Well, again, like what's fun is I only read one thing. I read things that are interesting.
Ernest, this was great. I mean, just your stories, your insight, your wisdom, your ability to continue to keep it relevant and keep it fresh. I love it. And I know that our listeners are going to find this to be a real treat too. So I
hope so. I really enjoyed this. And I said, it's like, I'll leave you because again, someone once said to me, they said, are you making up all these quotes or are they actually verifiable?
Could you imagine?
But well, one thing I like to do is to make sure people in a meeting are paying attention. I'll say, Einstein once said to me, in a dream, but in real life, at the height of World War II, Winston Churchill was known for giving those rousing speeches. And at one point, members of his cabinet sort of pulled him aside and they said, Mr. Churchill, it's great that like you get everybody, fired up, but things aren't going well. And, we really need to manage expectations. And Churchill said, well, I've always been accused of being an optimist, but what's the alternative? So I always encourage people, I go, look, the chances you're going to get the job are 50-50. You are or you're not. But, opportunities present themselves as opportunities are seized. And you might have, there might be a step between what you're doing and what you really want to do. And you just kind of have to say,
it's not always about finding the perfect job. And I understand that if you're looking for work, whether because you're in between jobs or you're choosing to leave your job or whatever the scenario is, look, I'm not going to say it's not a serious thing. Of course it is, but wearing it like a loose garment is going to help you a lot more in, let me be curious, let me be in the space of what's possible. I already know you have a similar philosophy to me, and that I often say, like, I'm creating my next corporate gig right now. You're creating your next assignment right now. I don't know when it could be next month. It could be tomorrow. It could be, an hour from now, who knows? But you're coming with the energy of that curiosity. What do I need to do? What do I need to learn? Who do I need to reach out to? What's possible? And you're wearing it loosely versus graspy, because when it's graspy, that's when people go, the resume or the CV or the portfolio looks great, but there's something a little off about this person. And that's where you don't want to be bringing that in there. So
I've often said to friends who, they were like, oh, I was let go, or I go, just pretend you still have a job.
Right.
Lots of people look for jobs while they're still hired. Don't lie about it.
Don't lie. Don't lie.
And the funny thing is, at the end of the day, I think one of the things that's helped me over the years, besides meditation, and caffeination, is when you really understand the concept of drama, right? Where the good stories take place at the extremes. I always remind myself, it's like, in real life, it's not like that. Like every moment isn't death of glory. If you tell yourself it is, you're watching a movie in your head that's a great movie, but it's not accurate. And
You
it's
also
not
can't think strategically if you're
exactly.
always operating from fear and anxiety. It's evolutionary biology. You cannot be doing both, fight or flight.
Again,
right?
it's fight or flight. So part of it is just reminding yourself, it's like, what can I do now? And then am I doing it?
Right.
All right, sister.
All right. Again, this was great. Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
And
thank you for inviting me.
If we have any questions, we'll do a follow-up and send you the FAQs of the questions, and we'll do a follow-up.
Be my pleasure.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Career Refresh podcast. If you're enjoying this and you want more information, go to my website, jillgriffincoaching.com. There you can find information on how to work with me one-on-one, or my group programs, or even bring me into your workplace. I'll put the link to my website in the show notes. But hey, listen, before you go, do me a favor, rate and review this podcast, because it definitely helps me get the word out to people everywhere so that they can also thrive in the workplace. All right, friends, I appreciate you. I'll see you soon.